The crack of her palm against my baby's cheek sliced through the room like a dropped dish, sharp, shocking, impossible to ignore. Even the soft mechanical buzz of the ring light faltered for a heartbeat, like the house itself couldn't process what had just happened. Rowan's cry stuttered, then folded into a stunned quiet, the kind that always scared me more than the sound itself. But no one rushed to him. Not my sister. Not my mother or father. Not anyone gathered around the Christmas table pretending to enjoy each other. Every pair of eyes landed on me, waiting, expecting. They wanted the usual script. I apologize. I make myself small. I swallow my own outrage so the family can glide past the conflict without ever facing it. But I didn't move. Instead, the scrape of a chair cut through the frozen moment. My husband, Marcus, pushed himself up with deliberate slowness, like he knew the meaning of every inch he stood. The way he straightened his spine changed the air, altered the balance, forced everyone to actually see what had happened. He locked his gaze on Marlene, my older sister, the family's forever favorite, and his voice came out steady and low. Leave! A single syllable, yet it hit the room harder than the slap. I didn't speak. But inside, the silence I had been raised in, the silence that had shaped my whole existence, finally cracked. Growing up, I learned to vanish before I even knew how to name the feeling. I was the kid who floated to the edges of photographs, the shadow behind the star. At family gatherings, I stood near the dining room wall beside the old spare chair, the one everyone called the extra, though it was always mine. Marlene, 2 years older and infinitely louder, always drew the spotlight without trying. Mom would smooth her hair, lift her chin, and murmur, "Perfect," as if she were crafting a portrait. If I leaned forward, her hand, gentle but firm, would guide me back. "Let your sister shine." Dad never objected. He simply adjusted camera settings, pretending not to notice me ghosting at the periphery. That wasn't the beginning of the pattern, but it was the first moment I felt it settle into my bones. And as I stood in my own dining room decades later, watching the mark bloom on my child's cheek, I knew. The silence was no longer going to save anyone. Right arrow, but the real unraveling, the moment everything tilted for good, didn't happen at the table. It happened afterward, when my sister followed me down the hallway. I rocked Rowan in the dim hallway, his tiny breaths brushing against my collarbone. His cheek still held the faint redness of a slap, a ghost of fingers under the warm lamplight. The house hummed with leftover holiday noise, clinking dishes, murmured voices, but in the hallway, everything felt suspended. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, confident. Marlene. She stopped a few feet away, one hip cocked, her arms folded in that performative way she used whenever she wanted to look wounded and superior at the same time. She didn't bother lowering her voice. "You caused a scene," she said. "Honestly, Joy, you're overreacting." Again. The words sank straight into the old bruise I'd carried since childhood. I didn't answer. I just held Rowan closer and focused on his breathing. My stillness had always meant surrender in this family, and she waited for it with smug patience. But I stayed quiet for a different reason this time, because my silence was shifting. When she didn't get the collapse she expected, she sighed dramatically. "You know Mom agrees with me," she added. "She said you're too emotional to take seriously." The words, once capable of shrinking me, barely made a dent. Instead, they landed like familiar noise, background static. Marlene stepped closer, lowering her voice to a razor-thin whisper. "If you want this family to stay normal, stop turning everything into drama. You embarrassed us." Us. As if I wasn't even included in that word. I finally lifted my gaze and met hers. Not angry, not trembling, just clear. Calm in a way she didn't recognize. Her expression flickered. "You heard me right?" she asked, almost unsure. "I heard you," I replied, steady. She blinked, thrown off by how unshaken I was. She couldn't understand that something had shifted the moment she slapped my baby, and everyone looked at me instead of him. When I walked away, she stayed rooted to the carpet, unable to figure out why she suddenly felt power slipping through her fingers. She didn't know. Not yet. But the script her voice had carved into my life, "Be quiet, be soft, take the blame," was already dissolving. Right arrow, and later that night in my own home, that shift transformed into something I never expected: action. Thoughtful, quiet, unstoppable action. We didn't leave my parents' house angry. We left with purpose. Marcus gathered Rowan's things with a calm that made the room colder than any winter night. I followed with my coat already zipped, Rowan tucked close, his warmth steady against my chest. At home, we moved silently, this time not from avoidance but shared awareness. There's a kind of quiet that comes when two people see the same truth at the same time. After settling Rowan into his crib and watching his tiny fingers relax into sleep, I stepped into the living room. I didn't cry or shake or replay the moment. Instead, something inside me aligned, like gears clicking into place. I opened a blank note on my phone. I typed, December 25th, 7:14 p.m., incident involving Rowan. Then I described everything. The angle of the ring light, the position of Marlene's hand, the timing of Rowan's cry, the reactions, or lack of them, around the table. Each detail felt crisp, factual, clean. Next, I opened my camera roll and saved the photo I'd taken of Rowan's cheek. The faint red imprint glowed under the hallway light. I filed it under a new folder labeled Rowan, Health Documentation. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't theatrics. It was truth preservation. Then I took screenshots of the family group chat, messages dismissing my concerns, Mom's comments about not ruining the vibe, Marlene's self-absorbed plans for her content filming. All of it went into another folder. Finally, I created a spreadsheet with tabs, timeline, witness notes, communication logs. My hands moved fast, almost instinctively, as if my body had been waiting years for me to stop shrinking and start recording. Marcus entered quietly and placed a warm mug at my elbow. He didn't ask what I was doing. He didn't question the folders or the notes. He simply said, "Take whatever time you need." Hours passed. Midnight crept in. I gathered medical notes, receipts, conversations, cross-referencing dates, building a clear picture of a pattern I had ignored because it hurt too much to name. When everything was organized, I drafted an email to a legal advisor I had spoken to once during maternity leave. No dramatics, no accusations, just facts, documentation, evidence. My finger hovered over send. Then I tapped it. The soft whoosh felt like a clean break from the life I had been forced into. Right arrow, but facing the truth alone is one thing. Bringing it back to the people who created the silence, that was an entirely different battle, and it came only days later. When we returned to my parents' house days later, the holiday glow was gone. The lights drooped weakly on the windows. The air felt stale, thick with anticipation rather than warmth. Mom had demanded a family meeting. Her tone left no room for discussion, but not once did she ask how Rowan was healing. Marcus carried Rowan in his car seat while I kept my jacket on, refusing to let the house claim even an inch of me. Marlene sat rigid at the dining table, arms crossed, expression curated to strike a balance between innocence and irritation. Mom hovered behind her like a guard dog. Dad lingered silently, adjusting a chair instead of facing the tension head-on. "Joy," Mom began sharply, "we all think you misunderstood what happened." Before I could reply, Marlene cut in. "You blindsided us with that email. Completely unnecessary." I set a folder on the table. Thin, unadorned, heavy with truth. My father frowned. "What is all this?" "Documentation," I said calmly. "Since none of you looked at Rowan that night." Marcus remained beside me, hands resting on the back of a chair, posture controlled but unyielding. Marlene rolled her eyes. "You're blowing this out of..." Marcus's voice sliced through her. "She struck an infant." The room froze. His words carried a weight that no one, not even my mother, could dodge. I opened the folder. The photo of Rowan's cheek lay on top, the faint imprint still visible. "This was taken 10 minutes after the incident," I explained. "A pediatric specialist reviewed it. Her assessment is attached." Mom's face tightened. "Joy, you didn't have to escalate this." "I didn't," I answered. The situation escalated by itself. I slid forward the additional pages, timelines, messages, recommendations from the advisor. Facts that didn't bend for anyone's comfort. Marlene shot to her feet. "You're making me look like a monster." "No," I said softly. "I'm showing what happened." Her voice sharpened. "You love playing the victim. You always have." Marcus stepped forward, quiet but steady. "Enough!" She opened her mouth to argue. He didn't let her. "Get out," he said, the same way he had on Christmas night. Firm. Final. Unmistakably protective. This time, no one defended her. Not even Mom. Marlene searched the room, finding only truth and consequences staring back. She grabbed her purse and left. The door closed with a soft but definitive click. Mom's voice trembled. "What happens now?" "The rest," I said, closing the folder, "is already in motion." Right arrow, but endings aren't just about confrontation. They're about what's left behind after the dust settles. The house felt strangely lighter after Marlene left. Not peaceful, just less distorted. For the first time in my life, the room wasn't bent around her mood. Mom stood by the dining table, small and shaken, like she was only just realizing how long she'd let one daughter be shielded at the expense of the other. Dad remained silent, eyes fixed on the folder, as if the evidence inside it had rearranged the way he saw the world. There were no tears, no apologies, just space. We said our goodbyes quietly, and Marcus and I stepped out into the cold air. It smelled cleaner than the house had in years. The drive home was silent but warm. Marcus kept one hand on the wheel and one resting near mine, not touching, just steady, grounding, a reminder that silence could feel safe too. Once home, I lifted Rowan from his car seat. He stirred, then settled against me, his tiny body soft with sleep. I carried him to the backyard, craving air that didn't taste like history. Winter sun stretched across the lawn in pale gold. Rowan wiggled free enough to pull himself up on the bench leg, wobbling like he was testing the whole world with his hands. He laughed, a bright, bubbling sound untouched by anything that had happened. I sat beside him, letting the moment unfurl. For years, I mistook silence for surrender. I believed shrinking myself kept the peace. But watching him steady himself on unsure legs, I finally understood. Silence is dangerous only when it doesn't belong to you. Now, for the first time, the quiet was mine. Inside the house, the folder lay on the counter. No one had called. No messages. No drama. Just stillness. Marlene didn't come back. Not with anger. Not with apologies. Not with excuses. The absence didn't feel like a victory. It felt like clarity. Rowan's laugh drifted across the yard again. He took another shaky step toward me, determination written all over his little face. I reached out, but didn't pull him in immediately. I let him find his balance first. Somewhere deep inside, a part of me that had been holding its breath for decades finally exhaled. Right arrow, but peace isn't always the end of a story. Sometimes, it's the doorway to understanding what the silence taught you. The remaining daylight thinned across the fence, stretching long shadows over the grass. Rowan steadied himself again, patting the bench like it was a new friend. The cold air carried that quiet, crisp kind of honesty that winter has, a truth without decoration. I inhaled deeply, letting the cold reach places in me that had never been touched by peace before. The past didn't disappear, but it loosened, untangled, lost its grip. Families don't always explode. Sometimes they fracture in slow motion, through tiny cuts so familiar you forget their wounds. But once you see it, really see it, you can't go back to pretending. I glanced toward the house where the folder sat untouched. That small pile of paper had become a mirror, reflecting years of invisible labor and the imbalance I had been trained to ignore. For so long, I believed keeping the family together meant sacrificing myself, keeping my voice soft, keeping my reactions measured, keeping my truth tucked away. But Rowan changed the equation. His innocence demanded clarity. His vulnerability demanded strength. And strength, I was learning, didn't always roar. Sometimes it organized notes and took screenshots. Sometimes it clicked send on an email. Sometimes it said nothing at all, and that silence became a boundary instead of a surrender. A breeze drifted through the yard, brushing against Rowan's hair. He turned toward me, eyes wide and bright, as if he trusted the world to always meet him gently. I hoped to make that true, at least in the space I could control. He toddled forward again, and this time I held out both hands. He stumbled into them with a soft, triumphant sound. In that moment, I understood something simple and profound. Every generation writes a new script. The one I inherited was built on imbalance. Spotlight for one child, shadow for the other. On silence that protected the wrong people. On love that demanded shrinking. Rowan's script would be different. It already was. He giggled, resting his head briefly against my knee before turning toward the yard again, ready for another unsteady adventure. I let him go, not because I wanted distance, but because I finally understood that strength grows best when it's given room I never had until now. Right arrow, and just like that, the quiet became not an ending, but an invitation to finally tell the truth about what the silence taught me. By the time twilight spread across the yard, Rowan was leaning tiredly against my knee, his earlier energy fading into soft, sleepy sounds. I brushed a hand through his hair, feeling an ache that wasn't pain, more like recognition. The past didn't vanish in a single confrontation, but it shifted, and that shift was enough to give me space to breathe. Inside, the house felt warm and lived in. No ringing phones, no frantic texts, no apologies wrapped in manipulation. Just room. I settled Rowan into his crib, pulling a blanket up around his small body. His lashes fluttered as he drifted toward sleep, unaware of the tectonic shift that had taken place in his world. Back in the living room, I sat on the couch and let the silence settle. Not the kind I grew up with, the heavy, oppressive hush that punished any attempt at honesty. This silence felt earned, claimed, owned. Families don't have to end dramatically. Sometimes they simply stop being the place where you leave pieces of yourself behind. I thought of the little girl in the dining room, the one who sat beside the extra chair, watching everyone else take up space she learned to think wasn't hers. I wished I could reach back and tell her she wasn't imagining things. She wasn't too sensitive. She wasn't the problem. She just deserved more than she was given. Rowan murmured a sleepy sound from his room, and I smiled. He would grow up knowing he didn't have to disappear to keep the peace. He would grow up seeing strength and boundaries, not silence. Outside, the winter air pressed softly against the windows, like a reminder that clarity often arrives in the quiet after the storm. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. The silence wasn't empty. It was the beginning of something real. If you've ever lived through a silence like this, you know it doesn't just mark an ending. It marks the moment you finally understand yourself, the moment everything shifts, the moment you start writing a new script, one built on truth instead of survival. Right arrow, and now I wonder, what did your quiet moment teach you?